the state that's overdone the heavy-handed social distancing rules more than any other is, of course, Victoria. It's Victoria where you can't play a game of golf. It's Victoria where police marched into a church to check that there weren't too many mourners at a funeral. And it's Victoria where the Chief Medical Officer has recommended the closure of schools to prevent parents coming into contact with each other at drop-off and pick-up, as if that can't be managed some other way. We'll have a look at this. Have a look at this tweet from yesterday. It's also from Victoria, and it was marking the Captain Cook anniversary we spoke about yesterday. Sudden arrival of an invader from another land, decimating populations, creating terror, forces the population to make enormous sacrifices and completely change how they live in order to survive. COVID-19 or Cook 1770? OK, that's the sort of nutty, inaccurate and divisive stuff you'd expect on Twitter, especially from someone whose bio squeezes in feminism and equity while specifying what pronouns should be used for her. But this person, Dr Annelies van Diemen, is the state's Deputy Chief Health Officer. Dr van Diemen, you're dealing with the biggest public health challenge of your lifetime, we hope, and we appreciate your work. But please, isn't it a bit too big and important to be used for this sort of pathetic politicking? Perhaps concentrate on getting the kids back to school. They might learn a bit about the history of this great nation. Let's cross now to Victoria and catch up with Liberal Senator for Victoria, Sarah Henderson. Thanks for joining us, Sarah. First up, just on that tweet, that ridiculous historic and political tweet from the Deputy Chief Health Officer, is that okay? Should the state government put up for that with that sort of behaviour?
Look, I think even Daniel Andrews, Chris, and good afternoon, I think even the Premier would be disappointed by that tweet. Obviously, the Chief Medical Officer and the Deputy have a very important job here in Victoria, as have all Chief Health Officers around our nation, none more so, I think, than Brendan Murphy, who's doing an incredible job. But I would just say I very much hope that she sticks to her knitting. It was an inappropriate comment. We don't need politics at this time. We just need to focus on all the things that we have to do here in Victoria to get through this as quickly as possible, and, of course, underpinned by the very best medical advice. There have been some divisions, of course, and I do really hope that Victoria will allow all students to go back to school within the next month, which is, of course, the unilateral position of the National Cabinet. And, of course, that's been reiterated very strongly by the Prime Minister and by the Education Minister.
Yes, it is just a silly tweet, and what they're doing out of that office is most important. You're saying over the next month. We know from what Brendan Murphy and others have been saying that kids should be at school now. Is Victoria the worst performing state when it comes to getting kids to school and trying to get society moving again?
Chris, look, I have to say, and the National Cabinet process has been very important as part of this, we have very much respected the rights of the states and territories to make the call in relation to their own jurisdiction and the restrictions that are put in place, and there have obviously been some differences. But in Victoria, I think it is very important that children get back to school within the month, as has been determined. It would be disappointing if that division continued. I have my own son here at home. I know for many parents this is very, very tricky, but most of all for students themselves.
I'm told if you go to Albury or you go to Mildura, you can chuck a line into the river and fish on the New South Wales side of the river, but you chuck a line in from the Victoria side and you're breaking the law.
Well, as I say, Chris, through the National Cabinet, we have respected the rights of the states and territories to implement different restrictions. There are differences of views as to whether that's appropriate or not. I think if you're a solo fisherman or woman, I don't really think that that's going to cause a particular issue. But let's not forget, Chris, that we're all in this together. We're working incredibly hard as a nation. We're very much trying to keep the politics out of this as we get through this pandemic. We have to ensure that social distancing remains first and foremost in terms of how we interact And of course, there are plenty of restrictions in place to underpin social distancing. But as you know, we've made some incredible leaps and bounds in how we have flattened the curve. But we have to also make sure that we don't have any sort of secondary spike, so everyone can't be complacent. So
sorry to interrupt.
That's all right, Chris.
Yeah, let's just move on to a federal political issue you're going to need to confront, the coalition needs to confront, and that is a by-election in Eden Monaro with the departure of Labor's Mike Kelly. Do you support these calls to bring in perhaps the Deputy Premier of New South Wales, John Barilaro, perhaps former Minister Andrew Constance, perhaps even your colleague Jim Molan? There's a woman who was pre-selected and contested it for the Liberal Party at the last election. Shouldn't she run in that seat?
Look, I'm not going to be making any comment on delicate matters like the New South Wales Liberal Party. Of course, the Liberals will run, and also the National Party have indicated that they will field a candidate as well. This is Labor's to lose, let's face it. Mike Kelly has been a very decent and honourable local member, but this is very much Labor's to lose, and I'll leave all of the internal machinations to the parties in New South Wales.
All right, yeah, Fiona Kopfos was her name, and it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out. Now, let's get on to Victoria and China. We saw that fast play out yesterday with Twiggy Forrest, that happened to be in Victoria. But Daniel Andrews, of course, and I was critical of him at the time, has signed up to China's Belt and Road Initiative, an initiative that they wanted Australia to sign up to. Australia wouldn't do that. We've stayed apart from this. Isn't this a classic case of where a state government, in this case Victoria, is acting outside its brief? It's actually interfering in the foreign policy, the foreign position of this country.
Well, Chris, I think it's really important to emphasise that the Belt and Road Initiative is an important part of China's economic strategy, and it's designed to increase its global influence. And Peter Dutton, the Home Affairs Minister, made some very strong statements when Daniel Andrews signed up to the second of those agreements in October of last year involving Victoria's infrastructure program, when he made it very clear it was not in the national interest. And I think in light of what we're now facing as a nation, the importance of our own economic sovereignty, it is just not in the national interest for Victoria to continue with these agreements. Now, what's worrying in particular about the Infrastructure Memorandum of Understanding is that it involves Chinese companies coming here to Victoria and particularly working on infrastructure projects. And while Daniel Andrews has rejected the notion of cancelling this agreement, as I've called on him to do, I would ask, how many Chinese workers does that involve coming across from China to Victoria? And the Premier has not been able to answer that question. And at the moment, there is never a more important time in our history, Chris, to be focused on jobs for Australians, jobs for Australian workers and for Victorian workers. So I really do think that it undermines the Belt and Road Initiative, undermines the very strong focus that Victoria needs to make in the coming months and years in driving jobs for Victorians and, of course, in supporting Australian companies.